Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Karen, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today in such good company. And I just want to start by thanking Ashley for the invite to come to Knowlton. This is my first visit. And also for organizing just such a compelling series of topics and conversations over the last 2 days. I also just want to say a really quick thank you to the presenters from this morning for sharing such an exciting range of projects. It really gave me a lot to think about. It made me want to change all these pieces in my presentation, but we're just going to run with it now. So I'm really excited for this opportunity to share a recent project today that's very much ongoing, and especially to reflect on this work under the provocative title of material fulfillment. So a lot of my work departs from an interest in looking at the maintenance rituals and the material afterlives of the building industry, and to kind of start to raise questions about how architecture takes stock of both its cultural legacy and its material footprints. And so under this kind of very broad premise, the idea of materials as registers or indexes to human desires is something that I've been thinking about a lot, specifically in the context of a group of recent work that speculates on the potential of construction and demolition waste to give rise to new material practices and new types of kind of architectural expertise. So on that note, the project that I want to share today is called All That Is Solid, and it's really 2 iterations of one project. And it consists of a series of material experiments that began last year during a 6-week residency at a nonprofit arts organization located within a recycling center in Northeast Philadelphia. And so sorry, my notes are a little bit mixed up here, so just one sec. And so the project, basically to give you a little bit of context, this is the site where I was working, and the studio that I had was located right in the building right off the side of the page. So the residency program is called RARE, and it stands for Recycled Artist in Residence. And it's a program that was started 10 years ago by a group of artists from the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts. And it was located inside this fully functioning kind of construction and demolition waste recycling center. And so the idea behind the residency was really to provide an opportunity for artists and designers and researchers to kind of engage firsthand with the sort of material reality of the waste processing industry, but also to work on these kind of full-scale site-specific projects. So within this kind of very unique context, I started to think about how this kind of really unmediated direct confrontation with the sort of materiality of waste could lead to a new way of working, something that I hadn't really been doing before, but also a new way of thinking about material research for architects that would allow for aesthetic sensibilities or value systems that are often excluded or maybe undervalued within architectural discourse. And so the project takes cues from a number of kind of very well-documented encounters with this waste stream from the past 50 years that tend to foreground the human and the material transactions of waste management. So in particular, these 2 diagrams that you see here influenced a lot of my thinking during my time at RARE and kind of provided an outline to the project. So on the left is a map of Mayor Lederman Euclid's touch sanitation performance from 1979, when she was an artist in residence at the New York City Sanitation Department, and it charts the trajectory of this very large-scale city-scale performance, where she traveled to all 59 of the city's sanitation districts and asked sanitation workers to shake her hand so that she could thank them for keeping the city clean. On the right is a diagram from social anthropologist Michael Thompson's seminal book, Rubbish Theory, that describes the transfer of value between trash and art object as a reversible cycle that relies less on the intrinsic physical value of the objects themselves, and instead on what he calls their social malleability. So in other words, on shifting cultural categories and cultural kind of practices of discernment. So read together in this context, these 2 representations of the waste stream kind of provided a really useful conceptual framework for me during my time at RARE for kind of thinking about some of the hidden labor structures and the value systems behind the site's kind of daily transactions. And so I essentially spent my first 2 weeks of the residency getting up at 6 o'clock every day and going to site to sort materials with the other employees on site. So I was observing their workflows as well as the language that they use to talk about it, where concepts like volume, weight, material memory take on really fascinating and completely different meanings from how we think about them in the field of architecture. And so armed with this kind of new vocabulary, I started to try to document some of the inventory practices and the unit systems of the recycling center, focusing on how incoming building materials were weighed, sorted into kind of piles and bins, processed, broken down, and eventually resold again. And I eventually became really fascinated with these kind of bales of materials that are ubiquitous to the recycling industry, where incredibly large amounts of materials are stockpiled into very small units for kind of storage and transportation. And so this is usually done using an industrial baler like this one here. And so bales come in a variety of different shapes and proportions depending on the kind of baler used, but they operate on the same basic principle, which is to stuff and compress as much material into as small a volume as possible. So these bales are also incredibly heavy objects. Typically a 3 by 4 by 5 foot aluminum bale, like the one that you see here, will weigh anywhere between 1.5 and 2 tons. And so I was really struck by the ruthless efficiency that's built into this kind of accounting system, and in turn its ability to start to reflect some of the rhythms and the kind of economies of scale that govern the recycled commodities market. But sort of on the flip side, I was also interested in looking at a bale as a kind of aggregate architectural system, something that still kind of retains traces of past uses and production histories. So on the right here is a detail of an Egyptian papyrus column from Owen Jones's The Grammar of Ornament, and it alludes to the ways in which Egyptian builders would carve ribs in stone columns to resemble bundled reeds that are held together with rope. And so for me, this image kind of serves as a kind of reminder that these affinities that I was seeing between what we perceive as purely functional and provisional holding patterns and more established ornamental orders actually have pretty deep roots in architecture's origin stories. And so going off the set of observations, I started to think about how like some of the material systems that I was encountering at the recycling center every day could start to give rise to a different kind of low-tech and ad hoc architectural materiality, and one that might just start to push against some of our ingrained, very kind of modernist and human-centric notions of material integrity or material worth. And so using the bale as a kind of frame of reference, I started to think about how I could make a different kind of lightweight sort of imitation bale, and to use this as an opportunity to work with materials that are sort of not commonly valued within the recycling industry. And so the material I eventually ended up working with was EPS, or expanded polystyrene foam, for a couple of different reasons. There was a lot of it turning up in the tipping yard every day, and mostly actually from furniture companies and theater productions. It's also a relatively kind of clean, uniform, and lightweight material, making it really easy to work with at a large scale, especially because I was working alone on the kind of first phase of a lot of this project. And then finally, it's also a deeply charged material with many conflicting optics and identities that speaks both to the sort of inflated desires and ambitions behind our modern consumption practices, but also to its material and environmental kind of consequences. And so due to its incredibly low weight to volume ratio, EPS foam is made up of 95% air. It has a pretty sizable footprint within the construction industry, where it's used as either a kind of lightweight substitute for masonry or for thermal mass, or as a kind of void filler in large-scale infrastructure projects, where generally it's hidden beneath soil, layers of topsoil, or kind of layers of concrete. And so, for example, these are 2 images from Michael Van Valkenburg Associates that shows the construction of Maggie Daley Park, or Millennium Park in Chicago, where you see the scale and the extent of the geofoam block foundations that were used to construct the park. So in many ways, it's the ultimate kind of placeholder material, one that is everywhere yet somehow kind of invisible. And so for the very same reasons, EPS is also a material that's notoriously difficult to recycle because it's not worth very much money in a recycling industry where everything is valued by weight. So in order to make a profit, you have to transport and process a huge amount of it, and not a lot of recycling companies have the means to kind of take that on. So as a result, a lot of it ends up in the landfill. It's banned from most municipal recycling programs, and most US landfills consist of up to 30% of EPS foam by volume by some estimates, which is a pretty kind of shocking number. So the idea behind the project was to try to reimagine this very kind of problematic image of this really uniquely modern material, and to try to do it in both quantitative as well as qualitative terms, and not just to do so through kind of abstract graphs and diagrams and images, but through a more literal and tangible kind of confrontation with the sort of materials that I was seeing at the salvage center. So I started by collecting foam fragments from the recycling center where I was working, and then I brought them into my studio where they were sorted by size and physical attributes, and eventually these pieces then became the building blocks for a series of kind of reconstructed bales. And I very quickly learned that you can't put EPS foam in a typical baler because it has so much air in it, and so I made my own baler, which is essentially this very rudimentary formwork that's lined with contractor plastic that allowed me to shrink wrap loose materials into these rectangular forms. And so here you see one of the bales coming out of its mold. And then these are some of the different bale iterations that came out of this process. So I ended up making a set of 9 bales over the course of 6 weeks. And they sort of double as a kind of inventory or index for the different types of foam that was turning up in the yard that month. And then when you kind of zoom into the details, you start to see some familiar profiles like electronics packaging on the right here. There was a lot of kind of unused food trays that was arriving on the site one week, or kind of more generic forms like linear stock, sheet stock foam, and a lot of larger blocks of insulation that we broke down into this kind of foam spolia. And so again, just to give you a kind of weight reference, these bales weigh about 15 pounds each, which is literally 1,000 times lighter than the metal bales of the same size. And so I wanted to try to photograph this funny weight to volume ratio in some way that would kind of capture this difference. And coincidentally, around the same time that I was finishing this piece, I came across these incredibly glamorous photographs from the Dow Chemical Company's historic image collection, and they were sort of essentially advertisements for styrofoam insulation. And for me, they captured the way that kind of these petroleum-based kind of plastics materials were portrayed in the 50s and 60s as these miracle materials that defied all earthly constraints like weight and cost and material shelf life. And so these are some other examples of the images. So often models, employees, and sometimes even children were hired to lift these blocks of foam above their heads to kind of create this illusion that labor is somehow rendered negligible by technology. And so kind of going off this set of references, I decided to kind of stage my own version of this performance. So working with a couple of the other artists at the recycling center, we brought the bales into one of the recycling center's warehouses in Allentown, Pennsylvania. The building is a former Mack Trucks factory, and this is my friend Billy Dufala posing with the bales, again to kind of create a sort of sequel to the Dow Chemical images, but this time reframed through the kind of inverse logic and aesthetics of the recycling center. And we also made this series of very simple kind of props and stands that allowed the bales to swing or to kind of rock back and forth to create these ghosted and motion blur images. And then finally, we played around with the architectural potential of the bales to function as sort of modular building blocks. And here you see them staged next to a group of aluminum bales for reference, so you get this juxtaposition between the most valuable and the least valuable materials of the recycling center kind of next to each other. And then when you sort of zoom in, you start to get a sense of the different aesthetic attributes that are created by these two very kind of contrasting materials. And so lastly, I sort of want to end by sharing a couple of images from a second iteration of this project that I worked on recently for Space P11 in Chicago that opened last September as a partner program to the Chicago Architecture Biennial. So I received the invitation to set up this show while I was at RARE, and in many ways it provided a really great opportunity to rethink this work that I had been doing at the recycling center off-site in a gallery context, and this time inside the Chicago Pedway, which for those of you who are unfamiliar with it is a series of underground tunnels connecting all of the office towers in downtown Chicago. So for me, there is something ironic and kind of appealing about going through all of this effort to divert this material from landfills, only to bring it back underground again and to kind of put it on display. And so I was also interested in having the piece kind of be site specific and to serve as a kind of index to the EPS waste streams in the Chicago area. So instead of shipping the bales that I made in Philadelphia, we, which includes myself and this really great team of students from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, spent about 2 weeks sourcing new material by visiting recycling centers and dumpster diving in the handful of foam drop-off stations that were kind of located around the city. So all of the material was free, and the bulk of the exhibition budget went towards transportation, labor, and a little bit towards storage. So we ended up with a little bit over 2 10-foot U-Hauls full of used EPS foam. This is my fantastic assistant Corinne inside a semi-truck full of foam for scale. And so for this iteration of the project, we also adapted the proportions of the bale to work with the spatial constraints of the gallery, which is essentially made up of these 2 fairly tight rooms with a storefront display along one side. So the idea was to fill the space completely with a series of 8-foot tall columns that went right up to the ceiling that visitors could, and they were placed on casters so that you could move them around to begin to kind of shape different spatial scenarios. The columns are just under 30 by 30 inches in footprint, and so they were sized so that they can get through the front door, but also so that they vaguely resemble the sort of space of one person. So when the gallery is full, you really have to kind of push around them and squeeze around them in order to kind of move through the space. And so here's an image of the kind of finished piece, and you can get a sense of what the space looks like when it's occupied, in this case by a group of high school students who immediately kind of knew what to do. And then this is a view from the concourse outside. So the idea is that when the gallery is closed and off hours, the whole piece would function as a kind of lit up diorama that you could view from the exterior, and that it would be different every day depending on how the columns were moved around. And so the show closed in late October, and we took it down, and the columns are currently in storage. And so for the next iteration of this project, I'm currently mapping out how I might take some of these pieces back to the recycling center where most of this material came from to kind of return it back to the waste stream, but also to do this through a kind of staged performance that we document in some way. So hopefully I'll have more to show on that front soon. Thank you.